Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am so excited to be here with my friend, Julie Faulstich, who is the founder and principal of Stony Creek Strategy. We have collaborated a bunch of times over the past year. She's spoken at events that I put on, has done all kinds of great stuff. And is just one of the brightest minds in independent schools. And if you're not familiar with Julie, she's former head of school in addition to now running Stony Creek, and runs a terrific newsletter. And Julie, I'm going to ask you to tell people how to access it, because I think it's really important that people subscribe to it, but it's called Talking Out of School. So with all that, Julie, welcome, my friend, to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you for inviting me. It's always...
Well, long time coming. I can't believe we haven't done this already. Before we get going, though, if folks aren't familiar with you, your newsletter, your work at Stony Creek, can you give us a little intro?
Sure. So I was head of school up until 3 years ago. I spent 7 years at the Westover School, which is a boarding day school in Middlebury, Connecticut for girls. Before that, I spent 20 years at the Walnut Hill School for the Arts. So, my whole career was in independent schools, boarding schools, and loved it, loved the community. At a certain point, with sort of life changes, it became unsustainable to have that kind of immersive career and then also tend to the obligations I needed to tend to. So I left and I founded Stony Creek Strategy and the Talking Out of School newsletter. So Talking Out of School can be found on Substack, and it comes out twice a week. And for free subscribers, there is a free post every Friday, which is usually a full article or an interview. And then Tuesdays I have like top 5 thoughts on variety of topics, including the one we're going to talk about today. And at Stony Creek Strategy, what I do is I call it applied leadership. So it's about leadership in action, because where communication and management meet, that has impact on your organization. So I do that through helping you develop strategy, through leadership coaching, through leadership development programs, like women's leadership cohorts, which we're just starting to fill one for next year, and also workshops. So communication skills and governance training workshops, because I am a passionate evangelist about trying to demystify governance and to also increase the partnership level of both from the board and the head perspective. So that's what I do.
Yeah, and you do it all exceptionally well. And your newsletter is something that I read every time it hits my inbox. And gosh, I don't know how long ago it was. Maybe it was a couple months ago. You wrote this article around the power of no.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I read it and I immediately replied. I'm like, I love this. Let's put it on. Let's have a conversation on the pod. But I'm just curious, like, what made you think to explore the power of no? Break it down for me.
Well, I've gotten to know such a wide variety of school leaders in the past few years doing this kind of work. And one pattern I've noticed, and I think you notice it more when you have a little distance, is how reluctant many independent school leaders are to say no to anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this has to do with a lot of things. We have to get into all of them right now in this particular response. But I wanted to explore that a little bit. Like, why are people so reluctant to say no? And I think it has to do with, conflict avoidance and Peoples need to prove themselves and all kinds of things. But I just wanted to put it out there because I think there's power in language to just state it's okay to say no.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about like oftentimes avoiding no is also avoiding like a deeper discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how have you seen that play out at leadership team levels? And like what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think we are all familiar with what people refer to as like yes people and no people. And we generally all want to work with yes people. Like people who are like, how can we make this happen rather than no?
Right.
But I think the way I've seen it play out is that if you're a yes person all the time, then at a certain point your yes means nothing because you'll just agree to do anything, even if realistically you don't have the time, interest, or even the skill set to do it. Mm. But if you are, if you're committed to being like spackle, like you're going to fill any hole, because that's what being a school person is, then you end up it's like the road to burnout. And with no people, what I've seen is they gather a lot of power around themselves. And often this is, I hate to say it, CFO roles, where like the answer is just an immediate no. We can't do that. You know, the word budget gets thrown around a lot. You know, I think there's a lot of discomfort around conversations around money with a lot of leaders who come up through more of the teaching end of things. So they just accept the CFO saying no. But I think they're actually that kind of saying no is just a greater discomfort with the complications of trying to get to yes. So, I mean, if people are just getting off on the power trip of saying no, like, I can't help you. You're a jerk. But I really don't think most people fall in that category.
Yeah. So you're like, there are two ends of the spectrum. Like you're pinning to the yes or you're pinning to the no. I think what I'm hearing is like, you got to be somewhere in that middle area where you say yes to some things, but no to others. So that when you do say no, like the trust levels are building because you're not necessarily agreeing to everything, but yet you're being thoughtful about like, where do we put our time and resources? Does that make sense? Like how, as you're thinking about building a team, like where does that well-placed no really become important?
Well, I think, and one of the things I say in the piece is that if you say yes, even though you don't think you have the time or the expertise or the resources to get it done, like, because one of the things that can happen is that a head, like say you're facing is some kind of a budget crunch. So the head says, we're going to double the annual fund next year. And you're the development director and you're like, the data does not support that. But yet you want to be accommodating and you want to be a team player. So you say, sure. Well, it's actually not a yes, it's a slow moving no, because unless there's some kind of miracle, like maybe you think you can just work really, really hard and change all that basic data and like 5 years of results in your annual fund to all of a sudden double it overnight just because you want it and you're willing to work really, really hard as your whole team is.
Yeah.
You're going to end up at the no place, but it's going to be worse because there's been a plan for a yes. So there's the wanting to make reality, the reality you want manifest, but often that's just not going to be possible.
So it sounds to me like that there's an absence of strategy in that example. Like,
yes, I would say it's like hope over experience.
Hope over experience. So like, how do you balance that?
Well, one of my, I don't remember which rule is. I think it's my third rule of administration.
Okay.
My first rule is people lead complicated lives. No, it's my second rule is be a human. And the third rule is no one reads anything. So for the second rule, be a human, I think that is the starting place of how you balance these things between being strategic and like basically counting on hope over experience, or as the head, that you don't want to fail. You don't want to get the board bad news. Maybe things are not working out like you planned. But also maybe you throw around the term data driven, but you're not really data driven because the data is kind of scary. So, I mean, I think if you're genuinely strategic, it doesn't preclude also being a human and acknowledging with your team that you're up against something difficult and figuring out a manageable way forward.
Right.
And that might include saying no to some things, because I also think schools just overcommit in general. I think it's probably a bigger cultural phenomenon where you promise every family everything, that you're going to solve all their problems when you want to yield them, but then they show up and, like any school, you have strengths and you have things that you don't do quite as well.
If you think about the value proposition that we put out into the market as schools, and like Julie, I would argue that parents have never had more educational options than they do today. There's choice all over the board.
Yeah.
Public schools, charter schools, online schools. I did an interview today with somebody who runs a micro school that's growing fast. Lots and lots of options. 15 years ago, we didn't really have to deal with a lot of that. Maybe, obviously public and charter was emerging, but a lot of those other things weren't in existence. Mm-hmm. We've had to make like bigger promises to families. The problem is, though, those promises are really expensive to deliver on.
Yes.
And we can't fully staff our organizations to meet those promises in a manageable way. So like, what do? Well, we ask people to do, what is it? Like, independent school administrator wears a lot of hats. You're a teacher, you're, an advisor, you're a coach, but then there's like 6 more hats that we're now piling on. And like that level of stress, like how is that sustainable? You know what I mean? It's really tough. I mean, I guess we're seeing it with faculty members leaving and it's harder to recruit new teachers. But when I'm talking to schools about stresses on the business model per se, like that's the first one I always talk about, because every school is living some version of it. It seems like maybe there are some outliers, but it just feels that way whenever I'm talking to heads of school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think this is a moment of reckoning for education in general, but I think there's a lot of schools, and I think the worm really started turning around 2008. Yeah. Where there were some fundamental shifts in the economy that schools were able to, I think, make other plans to allied, like so that they could get by.
Yep.
The boarding school example is, okay, we're just going to increase our international student enrollment after 2008. But, now we're in a world where that is not so easy to do anymore. And the international market is becoming as competitive, for full pay students.
Oh, I mean, Julie, think about the number of options there are in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, at a lower price point, mind you, in many of those countries. Not to mention, like if you're recruiting in China, the number of international schools that have just proliferated over the last 20 years, providing a Western style education at a much lower price point. Like it is really competitive now.
Yeah. So highly competitive. And I always think about it like the transition you went from vinyl to CD to digital. And the thing is, the music companies knew that digital was going to be the end point, but they made a pit stop in CD land because they wanted to triple sell the music. But the problem is you still end up at digital. And then it's very hard to make money off of digital.
Right.
So, and I think it's the same thing as I think a lot of schools made a pit stop, because even there were day schools building dorms for a while. But now, and the demographic problems are just getting worse as well. So you've got all these stresses upon stresses building up. And then you have got very committed, very talented staff who are just getting stretched thinner and thinner, trying to deliver on the promise of the brand to the families who show up.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. Like, I mean, obviously we kind of took a little sidestep there, but I feel like it actually plays really well into this overall conversation around no, because what I think is, after reading your piece and talking to you a little bit about it as well, is like it comes down to priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, no is important in order to be able to clearly identify as an organization, like what are the things that we're going to invest in and focus on in order for us to like thrive and build sustainable paths moving forward.
Yeah.
But if you get down to like the human level, you wrote in the piece that people often say yes when their gut says no. Like that's really hard. Like if you haven't been trained around that kind of decision making and that sort of stuff. But I guess even more important to that is like as a leader, how do you create an environment where it is okay to say no, so people feel like it's safe and that they can be honest? Because I think you at the beginning you had talked about like yes, a lot of people want yes, leaders want yes people, but I just don't know how effective that is.
I think there are some bigger cultural issues in the independent school space.
Mm.
And I think it can start at the board level. Whereas if the head feels they can't say no to the board, or say, like one of the things I say in the piece is like, I talk about how you say no to your boss. And even if you're getting the sense your boss really wants you to like run that committee or whatever, but you're just thinking, I've already taken on, more advisees. I picked up the extra section. I'm doing the independent study. I just don't think I can fit this in. It's to engage in a dialogue with your boss about, why is it important that I do it? Maybe we think about another solution. Is there something, you have a conversation and you figure out again how to get to yes. Or as I say when I talk about conflict, it's how to get to okay, so that you're both okay with it. You don't have to love it, but you can be okay with it. And the thing is, that can be hard with somebody in authority. If you're the person with someone in authority is asking you something, because the weight of authority is coming at you. So, I think that if the head is feeling under pressure from the board, because the weight of authority of the board is coming at the head.
Right.
Even though it's really more of a partnership, because the head and the board need each other, but it doesn't always feel that way, depending on the culture of the school. And so if the head is feeling like they can't say no, I think that then bleeds down to how they run the admin team. And I think it takes a very self-aware head to parse through the pressure they're feeling from the board, figure out how to push back at authority, and then really come up with some realistic solutions with the senior team, which may involve, again, making choices, making priorities, and sometimes saying no to some projects. I mean, this happens all the time. I mean, you have pressures from development with people who want to make gifts for things that the school really can't realistically do. It happens all the time. So often you say yes, and then everybody ends up disappointed. Or then one thing I just heard recently, I think you can, and you've heard this now more than once, because again, with these pressures that we're talking about, is that you have a board that is worried, and they're pushing on the head and the CFO for maybe a more conservative budget. But really, none of these things should be zero-sum games or binary. So what it should be is the board is concerned. I would imagine the head should be concerned as well in this environment. But you come up with 3 versions of a budget. You have the version the blue sky version, where you meet all your targets. You have the middle version, which might, be a little bit more realistic, make a few cuts. And then you have, oh my God, like things really went south. I mean, and I think a lot of us did this that spring of 2020, had to go back and, revisit budgets that we had all passed with our boards in January of 2020. We had to go back and do different versions because we really didn't know how things were going to work out. But the thing is, that's really, if the board is just saying to the head, save money, and the head doesn't feel there can be a dialogue, or let's talk about options, I think there's a problem there. But the thing is, I see this manifest in schools all the time, where it does feel like a zero-sum game. So it's either you're saying yes or no.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
if you think about how the models evolve too, of course it's going to get more complicated
Yeah.
because, we just spent 5 minutes talking about just a couple of the pressures on the model that's going to cause, it's going to, I think to your point, um, force schools to think about like, well, what is our board governance strategy? Like, how are we managing, at that level based on like just very different conditions than we had 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah. And I mean, and the thing is, it's just going to keep escalating because of the demographic trends, except in certain parts of the country, but also because AI is presenting an existential threat that right now we seem to be heading in this direction of AI literacy, which is a band-aid for the real issue.
What do you mean by that? Like, break it down.
What I mean is that I think this whole thing about, well, I actually put out in my newsletter today a link to an article by Clay Shirky, the tech thought leader who's at NYU now, as he's the vice provost. He wrote a very eloquent article about how it is very hard. Like, we can try to teach students how to use AI, but human nature is going to push them in the direction of using it in a lazy way, which is just write the paper for me. And can we surmount human nature? That's something to think about. I mean, really, I think the long-term solution is going to be to change pedagogy so that it's based on student experience and not outcomes. Because right now, when you're paying your tuition dollar, in the end, you're paying for a transcript that them's going to help them get to the next level. Not, I mean, of course, you're in one sense paying for the experience, but you're paying for an outcome. And the thing is, you can get that outcome with AI and have not learned anything, and it's not impacted you at all, and go on to the college of your choice. So how do we change what we're doing in schools to deliver on this experience?
Yeah. But it seems like there's also, like with any challenge, there's opportunity in that. But it's not an easy opportunity to operationalize. But like if you are able to change the systems and rethink, the learning methodology and what it is that students are going to glean from coming to your school, it feels like there's something there. And I'm guessing there's probably some pieces of it already in place.
Well, I think it depends on your mission. I think they're probably going to be like, if you're a place like Walnut Hill, where I spent a very long time, and where, the entire arts curriculum is based on performance assessment. Real time performance. You got to get up there with your peers and play your cello. That is going to put you as an advantage. So it's just things are just not going to get easier. And, a lot of these things probably aren't even going to manifest until I'm like, long retired. But I think that we can see where the direction this is heading, and the pressures are just going to mount. And the more that schools can get on top of, in a very intentional way, what they're prioritizing, what they're leaning into, and what their revenue is based on, then you're going to be ahead of the game.
A couple last questions as we begin to wrap up. You had talked about there's this powerful point, and this was at the end of the piece, where no can actually create space for other people to step up.
Yes.
Yeah. What does that look like in practice?
Well, this is my favorite story about this. Some people, if you were listening, have heard this multiple times, but I love it. I was academic dean for a number of years at Walnut Hill, and then I was promoted to assistant head and had a much bigger portfolio. And we promoted the director of humanities to become the director of studies. So he reduced his load by 2 classes and then took on a lot of academic administration. So around Thanksgiving, the first year he was director of studies, he came in my office and he said, "Julie, are you ever going to give me anything to do?" Because what happened was things would come across the desk for me and I would just take care of them because I knew how to do it. And also I was used to doing it, and I kind of didn't want to bother him he had other things to do. But I wasn't letting him learn how to do the job. And even though it was probably going to take him longer to solve some of these problems, it would have been doing him a favor to say no and be directing people down the hall to his office, or to be forwarding that email to him rather than just take care of it myself. And there are all kinds of ways that we over-index for people's fragility and say, oh, I'll just take care of it, when people might struggle a little bit. But I think, as we all know, if we work with kids, that's where the learning is, in that little bit of tension, that little bit of struggle. And that's how you learn. And that's how you get good at things. And that's how you build your leadership capacity.
Yep. Makes perfect sense to me. Hey, if a head of school called you after reading your newsletter, was looking for advice on shifting culture to make space for these more honest kind of no conversations, what would be like the first thing you would tell them they should think about?
I would say the first thing they should think about is their own relationship to authority, decision-making, transparency, intentionality, and their relationships with their senior team. I mean, again, everything bleeds down from the top. So that would be, and that's all. That is a needle you can move. I mean, that's all. The good news about that is that there are so many things about management that are about interpersonal relationship and about the dynamics of relationships and the dynamics of groups. And you can affect the dynamics by making changes in your own behavior and how you interact with people once you're aware. So that's my
self-reflective.
Yeah. So self-reflective and getting clear about what the school needs and why it needs it.
Yeah. This has been great. Julie Faulstich, founder and principal of Stony Creek Strategy. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's like the best way for them to do that?
The best way is probably just go to my website, which is stonycreekstrategy.com, and you can find all my contact info there. So
great. Fantastic.
Thank
Julie.
You.
Thank you.
The work you're doing.
I will, and sit right back at you. I appreciate you. And this is great. Thanks again.
You.
Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader.